Hi, and welcome to a new episode of the Evergreen Association. I'm here today with my good friend, Paul Schneider, who is also an Associate Executive Minister with me in the Evergreen Association. He's the Executive Associate Minister of Operations and Administration. So glad you're here, Paul. But for this episode, I don't want to talk about our work in the region. We'll do that for another episode. I actually wanted to do something I've been wanting to do for a while. You're doing something very cool that is outside of our regional work. It's a passion project of yours. And I referenced it a couple of times in past episodes, but I thought it'd be really cool to center it more. And I want to talk about the Oasis project. So tell us what it is for people who don't know what the Oasis is.
The Oasis project is an interfaith ministry that creates radically inclusive, safer spaces at conferences, conventions, and festivals for rest, recharge, and renewal, and emotional and spiritual self-care. Mm-hmm. What that means in practicality is that we create, we like to call them Oasis rooms, where we can control the lighting, where we can control the noise level, where we can set up a space that's quieter, it's a little bit less busy, right, than your typical conference or convention. And it becomes a space that people can step into in order to self-regulate if they're feeling overwhelmed or to kind of recenter themselves. We provide a bunch of tools in order for people to do that. So we'll use things like meditation aids, or we'll have books of short stories, or little games or fidget toys so that people can sort of distract themselves a bit. And very often what this allows is for someone who's at a convention where things can be overwhelming, there's a lot of people, there's a lot going on. When they're getting overwhelmed, they can step into this space, sort of recenter themselves, and then step back out and then continue to enjoy the convention.
I want to dive more into this, but before we get into that, could you tell us what inspired you to form this? How did this come about?
Sure. So I had been part of the science fiction and fantasy convention scene for several decades now, and really enjoy it, first as a fan and then eventually as a member of a couple of conventions working on the staff side of things, right? Helping to volunteer to make the conventions happen. And I was going through seminary, and I began to see some patterns that I noticed at my local conventions, where I was seeing people who were feeling that level of overwhelm, and sometimes I was one of them, and there was no quiet space for them to go to. And I know that for some people, sometimes myself included, so if you're feeling that level of overwhelm and you need to leave the convention space, whether you're going up to your room or leaving the property entirely, sometimes that means you don't come back that day, right? That means you miss out on a chunk of the convention, which is really unfortunate because these are really kind of very significant spaces. And especially for people who maybe have felt like they were lacking community, to find out that there's not just one, but hundreds, maybe even thousands of people who are as into the same thing that you are, sometimes that can be super affirming and also a little bit too much.
Right.
And so the Oasis is there to help people refine that balance so they can continue to engage those spaces.
Right. Wow, that's great. And a lot of what I'm hearing too is something that really connects with me about a lot of innovative ministry is because we identify an unmet need. You see hey, there's a need for this, and what can I do? And you don't know the unmet need unless you're observing and listening well, And I think that's really cool that you're able to identify that. So tell me a bit about how people respond to this. I'm so curious, the people that come through the Oasis.
So one of the things that was interesting about sort of putting the Oasis together was that there was no model for me to work with. Nobody was doing anything like this. And so I ended up talking to a friend of mine who was a police chaplain and asking her how she put her sort of thing together, because in my mind, it was very much sort of a chaplaincy kind of space that I was entering into. But also it couldn't just be that, because the church has justifiably earned some skepticism in a lot of science fiction and fantasy fandom. Science fiction and fantasy is very much about asking big questions, and there are churches that shut them down instead of embracing them, and people who have been shut down because of that. And so they are skeptical of the church. And so to walk in there and say, oh, I'm a Christian pastor and I want to do this, like, there are definitely some people for whom that's like an immediate no-go. Like, we can't do that, not in this space. It'll make it unsafe for the people around us, right? And so from the very beginning, I knew it had to be an interfaith project, right? To that end, I started reaching out to friends of mine who I knew were spiritual leaders in other faith traditions to include them. So this included people in other Christian traditions. This has also included people in different pagan traditions, and friends of the Jewish faith and things like that. And so that has been a really important part of this, because I can walk into the space and say, this isn't a Christian project or a Christian agenda. This is we are clergy of a bunch of different kinds offering a ministry to you all. Sometimes that becomes really important. And the Oasis can be that place where someone goes to when they're having that moment of spiritual crisis, because they know that someone there is going to be able to work with him. And just like modern chaplaincy, it kind of doesn't matter who they end up talking to. We've all learned about each other's traditions and learned about a variety of different faiths so that we can engage people where they're at. And so if someone comes in and they're not Christian, I can still engage with them and hear what's going on with them and be able to help.
Yeah, that's really great, because like what I love what you were just talking about was you're connecting that a lot of sci-fi and fantasy culture is really about dreaming a world that could be. It's a way of thinking of an alternate reality to speak about our own world, right? And isn't that what the church does, right? Like, we have a greater narrative that speaks into our current culture. So if anything, like, sci-fi and fantasy places should be the most spiritually open and welcoming and inclusive spaces, because they're doing what the churches do. But you're just talking about how a lot of people who attend there, they don't connect that actually we're doing the same thing, right? And with good reason, because a lot of churches are afraid of that culture, of sci-fi, fantasy. Like, I remember a lot of churches telling their congregants not to read Harry Potter, for example, or whatever. And I was wondering, how would you help churches to cross that divide, to not be so afraid of the culture out there? Because like, when I was growing up, I had this kind of feeling that we as Christians had to be the light to the dark culture out there, right? We had to go in there and we had to triumph and insert ourselves in the dialogue, or else we would be lost or consumed. What are some things that you would say to kind of reverse that line of thought?
One of the things that I think is sort of inherent in the question you asked is a difference in how we approach the world, right? I think we've been raised, and a lot of churches still operate in a Christendom model where Christianity is supposed to dominate. And that doesn't line up with the Jesus I read about in Scripture. Right. He didn't really seek to dominate anything. He was instead reaching up and reaching people where they were, instead of demanding that somebody already be perfect when they came to him. He met them where they were and then helped them become who they were always meant to be. And I feel like that's actually what the church is supposed to be doing, is helping people realize these amazing lives that they could lead, lives lived in kindness, lives lived in love, lives that moved forward and make the world a little bit more a place where everyone is valued and everyone is included, and that the differences between us are things to celebrate instead of things to be afraid of. And the church can be a model for that.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, earlier I was talking about that story when I was younger. As you know, like, I'm a musician, but I had this real dilemma. There was this, when I was growing up in Vancouver, there was this movement where youth groups were being challenged to like give up their secular music. So I'm dating myself now, but I had all these tapes and like I threw them out. And I remember how painful it was for me because I loved this music. And I just told myself, okay, I'm only going to listen to Christian music, not secular. And, you know, when we kind of compartmentalize the Christian and the secular, we're kind of implying like God is not here, God is only here. And so when I would interact with the world out there, I was like, oh, I don't know how to deal with this because like God's not in this. And we have this very divided view of the world. And so like what you're proposing, I think is very powerful, is that we don't have to be afraid of it. In fact, we're invited to engage in it and even learn from it, you know?
My very first class in seminary was a class called How to Speak to Youth and Young People About God.
Yes.
And the professor in the class said, here's something that's really important to know about culture.
Yeah.
God created humans with culture.
Yeah.
Therefore, almost invariably, everything in culture points back to God.
Yeah. Yeah.
What a different way of thinking about culture, right? We were created to build culture between ourselves, right? Yeah. Culture doesn't happen when one person is by themselves. It's what happens when two people start interacting, right? Culture is one of those things. And pop culture, I think one of the things that's really key about that is that pop culture are the meaning-making stories that our society tells itself about itself today. Used to be that we could reliably expect everyone to speak our language, the church's language, because that was kind of the default layer of Western culture. And so everybody knew our stories. Their stories were based on our stories. They understood that, right? They could see the parallels. Well, now our stories, the church's stories, these stories that are part of the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, they're not so well known in our society. And instead, we have these pop culture stories that are still built on those original stories, still have reflections of them or are pushing back against them or are integrating with them in different ways, but we don't have a culture that's literate in that anymore. So instead, we have these stories that are almost sitting in a vacuum, and our contemporary culture just sees them as the stories that are being told today. It's the language that they're speaking. And I still think we have good news. That world that I talked about, where everyone is included, where the differences are celebrated, where we operate first from a place of love, I still think that's a message worth communicating. And I think pop culture, being conversant in it, being able to engage with it in a very authentic way rather than just sort of picking out pieces and throwing it out to try and be heard, that allows the church to communicate the good news that we still have to share.
Yeah, and you know, I like what you're saying because I think there is a temptation to be like, okay, let's reject it all, or we let it all in without qualification, you know, and like culture, and I love what you're just talking about that when you're talking about the professor, because there is a profound act of faith, like a deep act of faith to believe that God created all humanity and God created humanity with culture, right? Like just having that act of faith really enables you to be brave to engage with the culture. But you can engage with it, but you don't have to endorse everything. Like some of it's problematic, right? Just like the church. I mean, I love so much about the church, but you and I are very aware it's pretty problematic in some places. And it needs dialogue. It needs engagement. And so I love what you're talking about too, is that we don't have to do the thing of like, oh, let's be the cool Christian and we do all the worldly things and like we can do whatever they do just as well. Because like it feels like catch-up culture and it's pretty lame. But if we could also say, you're all included, but you know, I have something to share too. You know, I want to hear what you have to say. I've got something to say too. And I think that is a healthy engagement of interacting and not walking away, but not completely assimilating either. Is like that's the really exciting part of this work of like interacting with pop culture for me. I was wondering, like, can you think of like a positive example, perhaps even in the Oasis project, where you just saw this really wonderful exchange with culture, not like something to be afraid of, but engaging in it and learning from it?
Sure. Last year, in August, the WorldCon, which is the science fiction and fantasy convention that happens every year where they give out the Hugo Awards, which are like the Emmys of science fiction, right? That was in Seattle. And we, my Oasis team, which has been running the Oasis at different conventions for about 12 years now, we became also the Safer Spaces team. So very intentionally creating these safe spaces and these affinity spaces that were out of the view of the dominant culture, where people could be authentically themselves. And so we had several different spaces. So for example, we had Black, Indigenous, people of color space, right? So a space where that was for BIPOC people where white people were not part of it, right? And so a place where they could be themselves and not be in sort of the dominant white culture, at least for a moment while they were in that space. We had a disability space, right? So people who have varying levels of ability were able to be in that space and to not feel pressured to conform or to minimize the difficulties that they were having or anything like that. In these affinity spaces, we arranged for meetups for things to happen. But one of the spaces that we had was an interfaith space. And that interfaith space was also the place where we did different kinds of religious services, and we had different groups that met up. So there was a Jewish fans meetup. There was a Christian fans meetup, right? There was an interfaith meetup. And I actually led the interfaith conversation. And so we had people of different religious backgrounds coming together, talking about what it was in science fiction and fantasy that inspired them in their own walk of faith, not just in any one tradition, but in so many different traditions. And hearing the overlaps and the ways that these different people who are profoundly rooted in their own traditions, who are faithful attenders of their services and people who practice, the tenets of their faith, find connection through science fiction and fantasy, find common questions that we're all asking, and then also find inspiration that guides them to continue to deepen their own understanding of their faith. That was really powerful, and it was really a great conversation to be part of.
That's really cool. When you're describing it like that, I feel like the Oasis is really about hospitality. This very generous saying like, hey, I can make a space for you, right? And we're not here to tell you what to do with the space, but if I see you, I love you in your uniqueness, and I've made a space for you. I think that's really powerful. It's very healing, just that in itself, whether people attend or not, but to know that, oh, someone made a space for me is really cool. And what I love about the Oasis too, I want to talk about was, as you're sharing, about how holistic it is. Because I was just thinking of, like, you had mentioned about all these different kind of people groups. And I was just thinking about how powerful for neurodivergent people the Oasis would be, in terms of like sensory overload, in terms of like self-management, like all of these things that people don't realize that could be triggered in these large-scale, Comic-Cons or whatever. I was wondering, did you start in a certain place? Because like it feels like in a way like you started with chaplaincy, but it sounds like you've now gone into hospitality at the physical level, right? At the spiritual level, right? At the social justice level, right? Of inclusion. Did it just kind of naturally extend that way, or did you have like a very grand holistic vision at the beginning?
So my original vision for the Oasis was just to create a space where people would feel comfortable and would be able to engage at whatever level they needed to. So one of the things that I love about the Oasis is that we have some people who come in and they sit down and they stare out the window for 15 minutes and then they get up and they leave and they never say a word. But that's what they needed in that moment, and they were able to do that. There are other people who come in and they are just, for whatever reason, having a really bad time. Sometimes it doesn't even have anything to do with the convention. Right. Oh, my significant other just broke up with me. Right. Or, oh, I'm in a really stressful financial situation. And the Oasis can be a place where they know that there's someone who's going to be able to hear them, and they can come and have their emotions and not have to worry about sort of being in a space that's public or something like that, but also not just going up to their room by themselves or going out and leaving the space. My original vision for the Oasis was to create a space where people who were having that moment of overwhelm or struggle or something would know that they could come, that they could have that experience, and then also feel supported in that process. And so to that end, like one of the things that has come over the years is like realizing that sometimes people get stressed out for different reasons. And so in the Oasis, we almost always have water and snacks. Gluten-free, salty snacks, sweet snacks, that kind of thing. Because sometimes what's making somebody feel bad is that they haven't had enough to eat, or they haven't had enough to drink, or low blood sugar, or something like that. And so having that kind of thing. We provide some very basic over-the-counter medicines in the bathroom. Oh, I have a headache. Here's a place where you can go and get a couple of Advil, or something like that, right? And that can make all the difference. And then the church and religion in general, but the church is suspect in some of these spaces. And so having a space where it's known that the staff are actually trained clergy people who know when to listen and how to listen, and then also, to some degree, know when to tap out, when to refer out. Hey, I hear what you're going through, and I'm with you in this moment, but long term, what are your plans for how you're gonna continue to be supported after this, right? Or, boy, this is a lot. It sounds like you really need to talk to somebody else. To that end, I mean, one of the things that we have at every convention that we have just in a Google Doc that any of the Oasis staff can access is we have a list of all the local AA and NA meetings that are happening.
So what I love about this, and when I was asking this, I guess I was leading a little bit because there's such an interesting parallel with ministry and churches. Because what I love about how you started was like you had a big question of like, I just wanted to make a space where people were supported when they're overwhelmed, to that effect. I don't want to reduce it too much. But what's more interesting to me is that you started with a simple question, but you let it take you somewhere, and you kept asking questions. So like when someone came, he's like, oh, you know what? They also need a da-da-da, right? Right. They also need a da-da-da. And so like you were letting the people who are coming guide you, you know what I mean? Like their needs. Because I feel like some churches, we say like, this is what those folks need, and then we just deliver and we're done, But we don't keep staying close to the people we're serving and say like, so what else do you need? Oh, you need aspirin? You need snacks? Oh, you feel like you're left out because you don't see people like you around you, And like, you just kept asking the question, and you kept letting it take you somewhere, and you kept doing something about it. And I think that's what's really great, because I think it's fair to say that the Oasis Project today, 26, and like when it first formed, when was it?
2013, 2014 was the first time that I was doing it at conventions.
Yeah, so I think it's safe to say it's evolved a lot, right? You've learned
Absolutely.
a lot.
One of the things that's been great about being interfaith is that as other people have come on board, they've helped shape the vision and helped it evolve. Literally, the first time I ran it in the evenings as a party. At a lot of these conventions, they have party rooms that will run in the evenings, and I just ran it as a like non-themed, low sensory space party, a place where someone could come and they could get some snacks and some water, and they could just chill out for a second and then move on. And there was like nothing beyond that. That was like my very first pilot, like, will this idea even work? Right. And then that evolved into something much more formal and kind of an intentionally created space that was much more regulated, low sensory, that kind of thing. Yeah. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that even though when I brought this, I was bringing it just as myself, I did from the get-go have that assumption of that interfaith basis, which I knew was going to be not just necessary for acceptance by the community, but also I thought was important because not everyone who steps into that space is going to be of my faith tradition or even have a faith tradition, right? And I wanted it to be an inclusive space that welcomed anyone regardless of that.
Yeah, and I think what you're just describing here is what I just want to make sure that, our listeners are keying into is that, you weren't so entrenched, you weren't so focused on like, this is what we're going to do, like this is what the outcome will look like. Like you let others people come into it, you let them shape it, you let it evolve because you let the people you're serving kind of create it for you, right? Because you listen to them. I feel like that's what probably makes this ministry so powerful and so wonderful is that you continue to let it grow and be shaped by the Spirit, and I think this is a great learning for pastors who maybe will never do anything close to the Oasis project, but that mindset that you had is so powerful, and I'm really so happy for you. And I'm excited. Like, I can't wait to talk to you like in 2030. And we're saying like, where's the Oasis project now? Like, it's going to be exciting. And I'm sure I love talking to people and saying like, hey, if you were in a time machine, and you went back to like, let's say 2000 and say, hey, Paul, you're going to do this thing in 26. You'd be like, what? Right? Like, you can't even imagine like how it's evolved and like all the places you've gone and the people you served, the conversations you had. So I feel like that's a great marker of like a ministry that is really moving with the Spirit. So blessings to you. I will make sure that when we post this, we'll have like links to like your website, your social media.
Sure.
But this is really something that I'm so glad you're doing. I'm surprised more cons don't want to do it. Everyone should be on this. And I'm really praying that you continue to flourish in this.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we are seeing more cons doing this. This started down in the Bay Area at BayCon, which is the longest running science fiction and fantasy convention in that area. But just this year, over Easter weekend, because that's when it is every year, we were at NorwestCon for the first time, which was really exciting. It's I've lived up here for a decade now, and this was the first time where sort of our ability to provide the Oasis and their need for it kind of lined up in the same way, and we were there, and I think we're very beneficial. We were part of Seattle WorldCon, so not only did we have those safer spaces that we ran, but the Oasis was specifically there in the hotel. And for the 2026 WorldCon, which is LA Con, happening down in Anaheim, we're going to be running the safer spaces again, and then the Oasis will be active in the evenings. And so I'm really looking forward to continuing to see how that evolves and how we can continue to help build those spaces, not just in the science fiction and fantasy fan communities, but that's kind of where it was rooted in and where it came out of and where we're seeing the most growth right now.
Awesome. How exciting. Great. I'm looking forward to talking to you more about it and just hearing how this continues to evolve and grow. But this is a wonderful work, and just keep it up.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us in this episode of Cultivate, and come back again for part 2, where we're going to talk about regional work. But thank you so much, Paul. It's been a real pleasure. And all blessings to all the people that come through the Oasis.